Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Silent Arrival. The golden rays of the setting sun kissed the tarmac, reflecting off the pristine surface of the jet's sleek fuselage. The air hummed with the subdued rhythm of engines and idle, a sound that bespoke exclusivity and opulence. A small team of ground crew moved with purpose, their steps deliberate as they ensured every detail was attended to. This was a world of precision, where even the smallest lapse in protocol could ripple into chaos. Captain Tyler Matthews stood by the foot of the staircase leading into the jet, a figure of authority in his impeccably tailored uniform. The golden stripes on his shoulders gleamed in the light, a testament to his rank and his belief in his own superiority. His pale blue eyes scanned the distance, searching for his passengers with growing irritation. "She's late," he muttered, his voice barely audible but tinged with annoyance. His stance, stiff and unyielding, projected an aura of control and command. He prided himself on maintaining order in his domain. This was his jet, his crew, and his rules. The first officer, a younger man named Ethan, stood a few feet away, pretending to be engrossed in a clipboard of flight details. He'd seen this side of Tyler before. The barely concealed arrogance, the impatience when things didn't move on his schedule. Ethan kept his head down, aware that even a sidelong glance could provoke a cutting remark. Moments later, a luxury black SUV rolled to a stop a few feet from the aircraft. The door opened, and a driver stepped out, walking briskly to the rear to open the passenger door. Out stepped a woman, her figure framed by the deep twilight sky. Her elegance was understated but undeniable. Her long, flowing dress swayed gently in the breeze, and her heels clicked softly against the pavement. Her skin, a radiant deep brown, seemed to absorb the light, exuding an air of confidence that required no fanfare. She walked with deliberate steps, her posture regal, her demeanor serene. Her hair, styled in soft waves, framed her face, and her sunglasses shielded her eyes, giving her an air of mystery. At first glance, she seemed unassuming, the kind of person who didn't demand attention but naturally commanded it. Tyler didn't move. His gaze flicked over her briefly before returning to the middle distance, his hands clasped behind his back. He made no effort to greet her, no nod of acknowledgement, not even a perfunctory "good evening." To him, she was just another passenger, one of countless others he'd ferried across the skies. Her elegance and composure didn't register in his narrow world. The woman reached the base of the stairs and paused. She removed her sunglasses, revealing strikingly intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything, the jet, the crew, and Tyler's conspicuous lack of welcome. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, then began to ascend the steps. Behind her, another figure emerged from the SUV, this one towering and broad-shouldered. He moved with a quiet authority that seemed to echo the woman's poise. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, and there was an unmistakable air of power about him. As he approached, his eyes locked onto Tyler, who still hadn't moved. "Captain Matthews," the man said, his voice deep and steady. There was no anger, no accusation, just the kind of calm that demanded attention. Tyler turned his head slightly, acknowledging the man with a curt nod but still offering no greeting. The man's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he followed the woman up the stairs, his movements unhurried yet purposeful. Ethan watched the exchange from his peripheral vision, feeling the tension that had begun to settle over the tarmac like an invisible storm cloud. As the passengers boarded, the cabin crew stepped aside to usher them in, their professional smiles unwavering. Inside the jet, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the tarmac. The interior was a masterpiece of luxury, polished wood paneling, plush leather seats, and soft ambient lighting designed to create an oasis in the sky. The woman took her seat near the front, gazing out the window as the man settled beside her. He leaned over and said something in a low voice, prompting a faint smile to play across her lips. Whatever tension she might have felt moments ago had been replaced with an air of quiet satisfaction. Back outside, Tyler watched the door close behind them and exhaled sharply. Finally, he muttered under his breath. To him, the passengers were just obstacles to the seamless execution of his flight plan. He was oblivious to the currents of discontent swirling around him, blind to the way his actions, or lack thereof, had been noted. Ethan cleared his throat nervously. "Captain, you might want to spare me, Ethan," Tyler snapped. "We're already behind schedule." The younger man bit his lip and said nothing more, retreating into his professional shell. He knew better than to challenge Tyler directly. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just transpired, something Tyler, in his arrogance, had completely missed. As the engines roared to life and the jet began to taxi down the runway, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the tarmac in shadows. It was a fitting metaphor for what was about to unfold, a tale where light and truth would eventually pierce through the darkness of ignorance and entitlement. Little did Tyler know, the silent woman he had chosen to ignore held more power than he could ever imagine. And her quiet resolve would soon dismantle the facade of control he so desperately clung to. The quiet unveiling. As the private jet ascended into the twilight sky, the golden hues of sunset gave way to a deep indigo canvas dotted with stars. The cabin was quiet, the gentle hum of the engines serving as a backdrop to the atmosphere of restrained luxury. Captain Tyler Matthews remained in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls, his mind already dismissing the passengers seated behind him. Tyler had always seen himself as the master of his domain, a pilot whose authority went unquestioned. The uniform, the sharp insignia, and the deference he commanded from the crew had always reinforced his belief in his superiority. The thought of passengers, even those on a private jet, held little importance to him. They were just part of the job, faceless entities he transported from one point to another. This belief had shielded him from seeing the nuances in human interaction, and tonight would prove to be his undoing. In the cabin, the woman reclined in her plush leather seat, her fingers lightly brushing the armrest. Her demeanor was calm, but her gaze was sharp, taking in every detail of her surroundings. Across from her, the man who had accompanied her, her husband, sat with a quiet intensity. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped as he spoke in a low tone. "Are you all right?" he asked, his deep voice laced with concern. She turned to him, her expression softening. "I'm fine, Marcus. It's not the first time and it won't be the last." Marcus frowned. "It shouldn't happen at all, Amara. He didn't even greet you." Amara sighed, her gaze drifting back to the window. "People like him don't see us, Marcus. To him, I'm just another passenger, someone who doesn't fit his narrow expectations." Marcus leaned back in his seat, his jaw tightening. He was a man of action, accustomed to addressing injustices head-on. As the CEO of one of the world's largest multinational corporations, he wielded immense influence. But tonight, he chose patience, trusting in his wife's wisdom. "Do you want me to handle it?" he asked after a pause. Amara shook her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Not yet. Sometimes, silence is the loudest response. Let's see how this plays out." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Tyler was reviewing the flight plan with Ethan. The younger pilot still seemed uneasy, his gaze flickering between the controls and the captain. "Is something bothering you?" Tyler asked sharply, his tone suggesting he wasn't really interested in the answer. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to speak up about what he had witnessed on the tarmac, but he knew Tyler's temperament too well. The captain wasn't the kind of person to reflect on his behavior, much less admit fault. "No, sir," Ethan replied, opting for the safer route. "Good," Tyler said, turning his attention back to the instruments. "Focus on the flight. We're already running behind schedule." But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was different. The passengers weren't the typical high-profile figures he was used to flying. There was an air of quiet power about them, something that suggested their influence went far beyond wealth. It was the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself, and Ethan suspected Tyler's dismissiveness might have been a grave mistake. As the flight continued, the cabin crew began their service. A flight attendant approached Amara and Marcus with a tray of beverages, her demeanor polite but tinged with nervousness. She had noticed the lack of acknowledgement from Tyler earlier and felt uneasy about it. "Would you like something to drink, Mrs. Hart?" the attendant asked, addressing Amara with a respectful tone. Amara looked up, her expression warm but reserved. "Just water, please." "And for you, Mr. Hart?" Marcus glanced at his wife, then at the attendant. "I'll take a coffee." "Thank you." The attendant nodded and quickly prepared their drinks, placing them on the polished tray table. As she moved to the next passenger, Amara noticed her hands trembling slightly. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes. "Excuse me," Amara said gently, stopping the attendant in her tracks. "Are you all right?" The young woman hesitated, clearly taken aback. "Yes, ma'am. I'm fine. Thank you for asking." Amara smiled, her gaze kind but penetrating. "If there's ever an issue, don't hesitate to speak up. It's important to address things when they happen." The attendant nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and relief. She had heard stories about Amara Hart, stories of her advocacy, her insistence on justice, and her unwavering commitment to lifting others. The attendant walked away with a renewed sense of purpose, vowing to be more courageous in the future. As the flight neared its cruising altitude, Marcus leaned toward Amara. "He's going to find out who you are eventually." Amara chuckled softly. "Perhaps. But it's not about who I am, Marcus. It's about the principle. Respect shouldn't be reserved for titles or appearances. It should be universal." Marcus studied his wife for a moment, admiration evident in his eyes. He had seen her navigate boardrooms, lead humanitarian efforts, and face down skeptics with grace and determination. But what he loved most was her ability to teach lessons without ever raising her voice. "Still," Marcus said, a hint of mischief creeping into his tone, "it might be satisfying to see his reaction." Amara laughed lightly, the sound breaking the tension that had lingered since their departure. "We'll see," she said cryptically, her eyes sparkling. Back in the cockpit, Tyler was feeling more at ease. The flight was proceeding smoothly, and he was already planning his evening once they landed. He saw no reason to dwell on the passengers or their silent judgments. In his mind, the flight was just another routine job. But in the cabin, an unspoken shift was taking place. The crew, emboldened by Amara's quiet presence, began to carry themselves with more confidence. Conversations among the attendants became lighter, their movements more assured. It was as if her mere presence had sparked a change in the atmosphere. Amara noticed this and smiled to herself. She believed in leading by example, in showing people what dignity and respect looked like. And though she hadn't said much, her actions had already begun to ripple outward. As the flight continued, Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing an email. His fingers moved quickly, his expression focused. Amara raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask questions. She trusted her husband implicitly, knowing he was always several steps ahead. By the time the jet began its descent, the stage had been set. Tyler, oblivious to the quiet shifts happening around him, was about to face a reckoning he could never have anticipated. And when it came, it would not be loud or confrontational. It would be as quiet and unyielding as the woman he had dismissed. This was only the beginning. A storm brewing. The descent into their destination city was smooth, the jet cutting through the darkened sky like a silver arrow. The city lights below sparkled like a sea of jewels, a stunning view that went unnoticed by Captain Tyler Matthews. For him, this was another routine flight nearing its conclusion. He was already thinking about the applause he expected for his flawless execution when they landed, a self-indulgent routine he quietly savored after each flight. In the cabin, the atmosphere was markedly different. Amara sat calmly in her seat, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she were absorbing the very essence of the journey. Her quiet confidence hadn't wavered, but there was a subtle tension in the air. Marcus, beside her, occasionally glanced at his phone, his brow furrowed in thought. As the jet touched down on the runway, the smooth landing elicited a brief nod of approval from Tyler. "Textbook," he muttered to himself, almost smugly. He powered down the engines with mechanical precision and initiated the post-flight checklist. In his mind, this was the culmination of his expertise, a job well done, no thanks to the passengers who, in his eyes, merely existed as part of the scenery. The passengers, including Amara and Marcus, began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. The cabin crew busied themselves with ensuring the process went smoothly, their professional demeanor masking the subtle unease that lingered from earlier events. As the door opened and the staircase was lowered, Amara and Marcus rose from their seats. Marcus instinctively placed a hand on his wife's back, a small gesture of solidarity as they moved toward the exit. Amara's movements were graceful, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. On the tarmac, another sleek black SUV waited, its polished surface reflecting the airport lights. A driver stood at attention by the rear door, his posture crisp and professional. Beside the vehicle stood two men in dark suits, their presence radiating an air of authority. They exchanged a quick glance as the passengers began descending the steps. Amara was the first to step out, her heels clicking softly against the metal stairs. She paused briefly at the base, taking in her surroundings, before making her way to the SUV. Marcus followed closely, his tall frame silhouetted against the backdrop of the jet. As they approached the vehicle, one of the suited men stepped forward. "Mrs. Hart, Mr. Hart," he greeted them with a slight bow. "Everything has been prepared as per your instructions." "Thank you, James," Amara replied warmly. Her voice was steady, carrying a quiet power that immediately commanded respect. In the cockpit, Tyler finished his final checks and removed his headset. He stood, stretching slightly, and prepared to disembark himself. Ethan, still seated beside him, hesitated before speaking. "Captain," he began cautiously, "you might want to reconsider how you interact with certain passengers." Tyler turned to him, his expression one of mild irritation. "What are you talking about?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The couple in the cabin, Mrs. Hart and Mr. Hart. I think they're—" "Enough," Tyler interrupted, holding up a hand. "Passengers are passengers, Ethan. They pay for a service, and we deliver it. End of story." Ethan sighed, deciding against pushing the issue further. He had seen the signs, small but significant, that Tyler's arrogance was about to collide with an immovable force. But it wasn't his place to intervene. Tyler had made his choices, and whatever consequences followed were his alone to bear. Outside the jet, Amara and Marcus had settled into the waiting SUV. The doors closed with a soft thud, and the vehicle began to move toward the terminal. The suited men followed closely in another car, their presence a subtle reminder of the couple's influence and status. As the convoy drove away, Tyler finally stepped out of the jet, his stride confident and unhurried. He glanced toward the SUV as it disappeared into the distance, oblivious to the storm that was gathering just beyond his reach. Back at the terminal, Marcus was engaged in a quiet conversation with James, the suited man who had greeted them. They stood in a private lounge, its opulent decor reflecting the kind of exclusivity reserved for the elite. Amara sat nearby, sipping a glass of water as she observed the exchange. "Everything has been documented?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but firm. "Yes, sir," James replied. "The footage from the tarmac and the crew's statements have been compiled. It's all ready for review." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good. But let's hold on any action until we've spoken with the appropriate parties." James hesitated briefly. "Understood, sir. Should I inform the board?" "Not yet," Marcus said. He glanced at Amara, who met his gaze with a knowing smile. "Amara wants to handle this in her own way." Amara set her glass down and stood, smoothing her dress. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "We'll let you know when we're ready." The following morning, Tyler arrived at the private terminal for his next flight, his demeanor as self-assured as ever. He strode into the lounge, expecting the usual pleasantries and respect that came with his position. Instead, he was met with silence. The attendants avoided his gaze, their smiles forced and their movements stiff. Even Ethan, who was already seated in the lounge, seemed unusually subdued. Tyler frowned, sensing that something was off, but unable to pinpoint what it was. Before he could ask, a man in a dark suit entered the room. His presence was commanding, his eyes sharp as they locked onto Tyler. "Captain Matthews," the man said, his tone neutral, but firm. "We need to have a conversation." Tyler stiffened. "What's this about?" The man motioned toward a nearby office. "Please. This way." As Tyler followed him, his mind raced. He couldn't imagine what could warrant such formality. He was a seasoned pilot, respected in his field. Whatever this was, he was confident it would be resolved quickly. But as he entered the office and saw who was waiting for him, his confidence began to waver. Seated at the head of the table was Marcus Hart, his expression unreadable. Beside him sat Amara, her gaze calm but piercing. Tyler's stomach tightened as he realized the storm he had ignored was now upon him. And this time, there was no cockpit to retreat to. The unraveling. Captain Tyler Matthews stood frozen in the doorway, his confident demeanor slipping like a mask that no longer fit. The weight of the room bore down on him as he took in the sight of Marcus and Amara Hart seated at the polished oak table. They were not passengers anymore. They were something else entirely, and Tyler felt the first tendrils of unease coil around him. Marcus Hart leaned back in his chair, his powerful frame exuding a quiet authority. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand attention, his presence alone commanded it. Beside him, Amara sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but unyielding. She looked at Tyler as though she were appraising him, her silence more piercing than any words. "Captain Matthews," Marcus said finally, his voice low and deliberate. "Please, have a seat." Tyler hesitated, his instinct screaming that this was no ordinary meeting. But pride, his ever-present companion, urged him forward. He strode to the table, his movements more stiff than usual, and lowered himself into the chair opposite the Harts. The man who had escorted him into the room remained standing by the door, his stance a silent reminder that leaving was not an option. "Is there a problem?" Tyler asked, forcing his voice to remain steady. Marcus exchanged a glance with Amara, who gave him the faintest nod. "That depends on your definition of a problem," Marcus replied. His tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an undercurrent of steel in his words. Amara leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on Tyler. "Captain Matthews, do you remember our interaction yesterday?" Tyler blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Interaction?" he repeated, stalling for time. "I don't recall anything out of the ordinary." Amara tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You don't recall refusing to greet me when I arrived at the jet?" Tyler stiffened. "I don't. I mean, it wasn't intentional. I was focused on preparing for the flight. Protocol requires." "Protocol," Amara interrupted gently, her voice cutting through his excuses like a scalpel. "Does protocol include ignoring a passenger entirely? Or failing to acknowledge someone with basic courtesy?" Tyler flushed, his composure faltering. "It wasn't personal. I treat all passengers the same." "Exactly," Marcus said, leaning forward now. His gaze pinned Tyler in place. "And that's the problem. You failed to see who was in front of you, not because you were busy, but because you made a choice. A choice rooted in arrogance." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Tyler opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. The Hart's words had a precision that left no room for rebuttal. Amara reached into her bag and retrieved a sleek tablet, setting it on the table. With a few taps, she brought up a video. The footage from the tarmac played on the screen, showing Tyler standing stiffly at the base of the stairs as Amara approached. His lack of acknowledgement was glaring, his indifference palpable. "This was taken by one of the ground crew," Amara said, her voice calm but firm. "Do you see yourself in this video, Captain Matthews?" Tyler's jaw tightened. "I see myself, yes. But it doesn't show the context. It's not fair to. Context? Amara interrupted again, her tone soft but unyielding. What context justifies disrespect? What context excuses a failure to offer even the barest courtesy? Tyler's shoulders slumped slightly. He could feel the walls closing in, the carefully constructed image of his authority crumbling under the weight of their scrutiny. Marcus leaned forward again, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Do you know who my wife is, Captain? Tyler hesitated, his mind racing. He had dismissed the passengers so thoroughly that he had never bothered to learn their names, let alone their significance. He shook his head slowly, the first crack in his bravado. Amara Hart is not just any passenger, Marcus continued, his tone growing colder. She is a global philanthropist, an advocate for equity, and a woman whose work has changed the lives of countless people around the world. Her name is spoken in boardrooms and policy circles. And yet, you saw fit to treat her as invisible. Amara's expression softened slightly, but her words were no less cutting. This isn't about my title or my work, Captain Matthews. This is about a mindset. A mindset that devalues others based on preconceived notions. Yesterday, you didn't see me because I didn't fit the image you associate with importance. That is the heart of the issue. Tyler swallowed hard, his arrogance now replaced with a growing sense of dread. He realized too late that his actions, or lack thereof, had been noticed, dissected, and found wanting. The man by the door stepped forward, placing a folder on the table. This contains statements from your crew, he said, his voice neutral. They corroborate the events as described by Mrs. Hart. Tyler glanced at the folder, but didn't dare open it. He could feel the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him, threatening to crush whatever remained of his pride. We've already shared this with the airline, Marcus said, his tone like the calm before a storm. They were appalled by your behavior. The board of directors is reviewing the matter as we speak. Tyler's head shot up, panic flashing in his eyes. The board? But I've been a loyal employee for years. My record. Your record doesn't excuse poor character, Marcus cut in, his voice as sharp as a blade. You're entrusted with more than the mechanics of flying. You're entrusted with representing the values of the airline and respecting the people you serve. Amara leaned back, her gaze never leaving Tyler's. We're not here to destroy your career, Captain. That's not our goal. But there are consequences to every action, or inaction. And this is yours. The meeting ended with Tyler excusing himself, his once confident stride now a humbled shuffle. He walked out of the office, feeling the full weight of his actions and the implications they carried. For the first time, he understood the gravity of respect, not just as a professional obligation but as a fundamental human value. Inside the office, Amara turned to Marcus. Do you think he learned anything? Marcus smiled faintly. If he didn't, the board's decision will ensure he remembers. Amara nodded, her expression thoughtful. Sometimes, it takes a storm to clear the air. As they left the office, hand in hand, the quiet power of their resolve lingered in the space they had occupied, a testament to the impact of integrity and the importance of holding others accountable. Redemption or ruin. The following weeks unfolded like an unraveling tapestry for Captain Tyler Matthews. The fallout from his actions during that fateful flight reached far beyond the confines of the jet he had so arrogantly commanded. The Hart family's influence, though wielded with grace, had set in motion a series of events that would challenge not only Tyler's career but also the very foundation of his identity. The airline's response. 2 days after the meeting with the Harts, Tyler was summoned to the airline's headquarters for a formal review. The boardroom, stark and imposing, was filled with senior executives, legal advisors, and representatives from human resources. Tyler sat at the far end of the table, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The head of the board, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, began the proceedings. Captain Matthews, we've reviewed the statements, video evidence, and corroborating accounts regarding your behavior on the flight with Mr. and Mrs. Hart. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I understand there were issues, he began, but the woman cut him off. Issues is an understatement, she said firmly. Your conduct not only failed to meet our professional standards, but also demonstrated a troubling lack of awareness and respect. Another board member, an older man with a kind but disappointed expression, chimed in. We are an airline that prides itself on delivering not just excellent service, but also inclusivity and respect for every passenger. Your actions, or rather, your inactions, threaten that reputation. Tyler felt his pulse quicken. He had spent years building his career, climbing the ranks with what he believed was unassailable competence. Now, it all seemed to hang by a thread. We've decided to place you on suspension, effective immediately, the board chairwoman continued. During this time, you will be required to undergo sensitivity training and participate in our corporate values program. Only after completing these steps will we evaluate whether you're fit to return to your position. The words struck Tyler like a physical blow. Suspension? Sensitivity training? It was a public acknowledgement of his failure, a humiliation he hadn't anticipated. But, he started to protest, only to be met with the chairwoman's steely gaze. This isn't negotiable, Captain Matthews, she said. Consider this an opportunity to reflect and grow. Many don't get that chance. The hearts move forward. While Tyler grappled with his suspension, Amara and Marcus Hart continued their lives, their focus shifting back to their philanthropic work. Their organization, the Hart Foundation, had a slate of upcoming initiatives aimed at addressing systemic inequities, and both were eager to push forward. One morning, as Amara sat in her sunlit home office reviewing proposals, Marcus entered with a steaming cup of tea. You're working too hard, he teased, setting the cup down beside her. She smiled up at him. Says the man who's been on 5 conference calls this morning. He chuckled, leaning against the desk. True, but I've been thinking about Tyler Matthews. Amara raised an eyebrow. Still? Marcus nodded. I can't help but wonder if we were too harsh. Her expression softened. You weren't. What we did wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. There's a difference. Marcus sat down across from her, his brow furrowed. Do you think he'll change? Amara took a sip of her tea, considering the question. That depends on him. Growth requires humility, and humility isn't something you can impose on someone. They have to choose it for themselves. Her words hung in the air, a quiet truth that Marcus respected deeply. He reached across the desk, taking her hand. You're remarkable, you know that? She laughed lightly, squeezing his hand. So are you. Now, go finish your calls. The world doesn't wait for even the great Marcus Hart. Tyler's turning point. Suspension proved to be a humbling experience for Tyler. Stripped of his uniform and title, he found himself confronting the parts of himself he had long ignored. The sensitivity training sessions were grueling, not because the material was difficult, but because they forced him to face truths he had avoided. One day, during a group session, the facilitator posed a question that struck a nerve. What does respect mean to you? Tyler hesitated, then answered honestly. It's about treating others as equals. About seeing them for who they are, not what they look like or what they do. The facilitator nodded. And do you feel you've done that in your career? The question lingered in the room, heavy and unforgiving. Tyler swallowed hard. No, he admitted quietly. I haven't. That admission marked a turning point. Over the next weeks, Tyler immersed himself in the training, not just to fulfill the requirements but to genuinely understand the lessons being taught. He read books on unconscious bias, attended lectures on diversity and inclusion, and even sought out conversations with colleagues he had previously dismissed. Slowly, he began to see the world through a new lens, one that challenged his assumptions and expanded his understanding of humanity. A chance encounter. Months later, Tyler found himself on a commercial flight as a passenger, a humbling reversal of roles. As he settled into his seat, he noticed a familiar figure boarding the plane. Amara Hart. She moved gracefully down the aisle, her presence as commanding as ever. Tyler's heart raced. He debated whether to approach her, unsure if she would even recognize him. But as she walked past, her eyes met his, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Captain Matthews," she said, stopping beside his seat. Her tone was neutral, but there was a hint of curiosity in her expression. "Mrs. Hart," he replied, standing awkwardly. I didn't expect to see you here." She smiled faintly. "Life is full of surprises." There was a pause, and Tyler seized the moment. "I want to apologize," he said earnestly, "for how I treated you and your husband. I've had time to reflect, and I realize now how wrong I was." "I'm sorry." Amara studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "Thank you for saying that. Growth is a journey, Captain Matthews. I hope you continue on it." With that, she continued to her seat, leaving Tyler to sink back into his own. Her words echoed in his mind, a reminder of the road ahead. The quiet redemption. When Tyler returned to work, he was a changed man. His colleagues noticed the difference immediately, his arrogance replaced by humility, his indifference by genuine engagement. He greeted every passenger warmly, regardless of their appearance or status, and took time to mentor younger pilots with patience and kindness. One day, as he prepared for a flight, he received a handwritten note from Amara Hart. It was simple but profound. "Captain Matthews. The measure of a person is not in their mistakes, but in how they rise from them. Continue rising. Amara Hart." Tyler folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket, a talisman of the journey he had undertaken. He had lost his way once, but now, he was determined to chart a new course, one guided by respect, empathy, and the quiet strength he had learned from a woman who had once been invisible to him.